I think that's an appropriate place to start the evening's panel on the legacy and future of John F. Kennedy. So to just get the discussion started, let me introduce Harley Schlanger, who's been one of Lynn's collaborators for decades. He's been Mr. LaRouche's Western State spokesman for a decade and more. And he's also someone who was provoked into politics at a young age by John F. Kennedy. So Harley Schlanger.
I think the question that many of you have is, what's it going to take to change history? We've heard that there are people around the world who are looking for leadership, looking to the United States to regain its stature. We've had the problem, as Lyndon LaRouche identified, of two administrations, that of Bush Jr. and Obama, that have been worse than terrible. But the other administrations preceding them, going back to John Kennedy, have not given us much hope either. You think about the Nixon administration. You think about that peanut farmer from Georgia who probably made the peanuts very happy when he went to D.C. You think about the potential with Reagan, his willingness to bring LaRouche in as a collaborator, but probably his loss of mental capacity toward the end of his second term. But from the beginning, Reagan was hampered by the fact that he had a Bush as a vice president. In a sense, we've had 5 terms of Bush in recent history, with George H.W. Bush and then George W. And George H.W., with 2 terms as vice president, was running the White House at least part of that time. So the question then comes to us, what do we as individuals have to do to change history? Now, I thought Helga made an interesting point today in bringing up the case of Edward Snowden, who just turned 30, but has done something that required an act of great courage. And I want to start with something Lyndon LaRouche said about courage last night, because he was asked about Snowden and what it is that gives courage to act in history as a leader. And there are many things that I could say about it, but I want to start with what Lynn said, because he took it as a personal question, about his role. And what he said is, my motivation is not to be a hero as such. My motivation is not to gain something as such. My motivation is to know that I'm going to die. And that the question is, what will I have contributed to humanity? Now, if you think about that in the proper way, this question of immortality is one of the most important questions that any of us have to face. It's the most important question, because the nature of all human beings is you live and you're going to die. And the question is, do you have something to live for, but which you're willing to fight for and give your life if necessary? And that's why Lynn said it's not just a question of courage in warfare. A lot of people can be war heroes at 20, 21, 22, and you ask them afterwards, why did you do what you did? Why did you risk your life? And I'm not sure. It's what I was supposed to do. And proper military training gives you that sense of acting for the purpose of the unit, of the fight. But what does it take to dedicate a life, to take on the forces of powerful networks and to overcome them, even if you give your life in the process? And we have 2 examples, 2 prime examples in history. One is a little more remote, the case of Abraham Lincoln, but he's not so remote because we have some of the beautiful statements that he made that give us insights into his mind. The Gettysburg Address as one example. But we have someone even closer to us in time, and many people here, I can tell from the white hair or the lack of hair, that many people remember that day almost 50 years ago when a young president was taken away from us. A president who was just beginning to assert the powers of his office. And I want to give you a little bit of background and some insight so that as we move toward the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we don't just see it as a tragedy and weep tears, which would really be tears of hypocrisy. But we take his example and make it personal. Because the Kennedy who is the real person is not the one that most of you know. And the real tragedy is that his death coincided with the takeover of the political forces that we're fighting today. These, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. So I want to take a look at that briefly and give you some insights into Kennedy's mind. Now, what we're facing today is not really Barack Obama. He's a puppet. He's a front man. What we're facing is a gang of financial, insurance, and raw material cartels, an interlocking directorate, a corporate elite which is globalist, which hates the idea of national sovereignty, which is committed to genocide of a scale that, as Lynn identified this morning, wiping out 6 of the 7 billion people on the planet. And this is a banking and finance cartel which was on the ropes in the 1930s, taken on by Franklin Roosevelt, who came from their midst. And through the banking reforms in particular, in the first 100 days of office, including especially the Glass-Steagall bill, Franklin Roosevelt nearly put them out of business. And he was clear on this. He was fighting this group of bankers, which included, on the Democratic side, the Harriman networks, and on the Republican side, Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George Jr. And it was the Harriman and Bush networks that financed Adolf Hitler in conjunction with some British networks and some German bankers. Now, Roosevelt put them on the defensive. World War II put them on the defensive, but Roosevelt died. And we ended up with Harry Truman. And Truman was basically taken over from the beginning by those two factions, the Harriman faction in the Democratic Party and the Bush faction, which at that point was much more the Dulles faction, Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles. And their view was that they were going to wipe out that FDR impetus. And Franklin Roosevelt saw the end of the war as an opportunity to take the machinery that enabled us to win the war, the so-called arsenal of democracy, the auto sector, the machine tool sector, that had been flattened by the Depression, but by the early 40s was producing miracles in turning out ships and tanks and planes. And most importantly, skilled labor, including women, including people from the Appalachian area and black sharecroppers who moved north to work in the factories. And Roosevelt's idea was to use that in peacetime to develop the world. His idea of the 4 freedoms. But his idea was an anti-colonial United States, true to our revolutionary roots. Remember, we are a revolutionary nation. We were founded by people who fought an oligarchy, fought the British monarchy, but not just the British monarchy, fought the idea that private interests can control government and should have more power than the interests of the people. Our Constitution enshrines this idea that government is there to serve the interests of the people and to protect the people from the overweening influence or power of those private interests, whether it's the British East India Company in the 18th century or J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and others today. And the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, of Roosevelt's banking reform bill, gave those cartels carte blanche to do whatever they wanted with the economy and with the people. Now, the fight in the post-war period with Truman, one of the things Truman did, what was set up was this idea that we have two empires, the East Bloc and the Western free nations, and that our whole policy was going to be to have a two-empire division of the world, and that our side was good, their side was evil, and we're going to be motivated to do what we do to defeat the evil of the other side. And partly to fight that, Truman enacted policies which we're still paying for today. The National Security Agency, the spies, where do they come from? Harry Truman. The CIA, Harry Truman. Loyalty oaths for government, Harry Truman. And the idea that we could fight and win a nuclear war was what was given to Truman. And there's a famous story of the day that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, when real soldiers like General Douglas MacArthur saw that as a tragic act, not just because of the people killed, but because of the danger that people would now use these weapons to try and win wars. Truman was jubilant. He was on an aircraft carrier somewhere, and he went around shaking people's hands, saying, "This is a great day. We have the bomb. We won the war." Now, there was a young sailor in that war who had a different point of view. And fortunately, we had him as a president for a brief period of time, 1,000 days. Now, John Kennedy had this same view as FDR, anti-colonial. And I'm not going to go through this. Tony Chaikin, the historian with our organization, has written some beautiful articles recently on the anti-imperial, anti-colonial side of John F. Kennedy. That Kennedy sided with Algeria against the French. He sided with Vietnam against the French. He sided with the developing African nations against the colonial powers of Britain, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Belgians. That's one side of Kennedy. But the other side that shaped him was the horror of the dangers of nuclear war. And some people think, well, this happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we came very close to nuclear war over Cuba. But listen to this quote from the young John Kennedy in his first campaign for Congress in 1946. And you'll see elements of this question of the individual in it. This idea that we as individuals have a responsibility for the future. Kennedy said, "What we do now will shape the history of civilization for many years to come. We have a weary world trying to bind the wounds of a fierce struggle. This is dire enough. What is infinitely far worse is that we have a world which has unleashed the terrible powers of atomic energy." He meant atomic weapons. "We have a world capable of destroying itself. Above all, day and night, with every ounce of ingenuity and industry we possess, we must work for peace. We must not have another war." Now, in this, Kennedy was reflecting a statement made by Albert Einstein after the dropping of atomic weapons on Japan. Einstein said, "Humanity has reached a new age. Either we end war or war will end us." Now, you know, sometimes we in the LaRouche movement are accused of making extreme statements. And people say, oh, Lyndon LaRouche is always saying, we could have a nuclear war and it'll wipe out civilization. Well, that happens to be true, first of all. But this is what Kennedy said repeatedly, that we face a danger of war which could wipe out human civilization. At one point in his administration, he said, we have the possibility to be the best generation ever or the last. Was he extreme? Was he an extremist? He was telling the truth. And that danger which existed at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin crises that occurred in 61 and 62. That danger is still with us. Do you realize that Obama came very close to getting us into thermonuclear war had he gone ahead with his plan to attack Syria? Do you realize it was the Russians working with the U.S. military that convinced Obama he'd better go to the Congress? And when he went to the Congress, you spoke up. The American people spoke up and said, no war. A war-weary people spoke out. And Obama temporarily backed off because the Congress was getting 100 calls against the war for every call supporting it. John McCain was probably very busy calling all the congressional offices saying, we got to go to war. But that war didn't happen. But now we're letting Obama off the hook. So I want to go back to a couple things from Kennedy to give you a sense of what he did that was so important and why we must honor him, not just by crying or jumping up and saying, I love Jack, but to actually take his spirit and make it our own. Because what we had in this country in the early 60s has been lost. An idea of scientific and technological progress, a commitment to ending colonialism. I mean, just to give you an example, the International Monetary Fund is one of the agencies that's the biggest killer in the world. And Obama announced yesterday that he's ordered the NSA to stop spying on the IMF and the World Bank. Those are the two agencies we should be spying on. He's got it all wrong. Now, one other thing, keep in mind, there's an irony with Kennedy because he was a Cold Warrior. He was committed to being strong in this country because he knew Soviet communism was an evil. But he also said that while we fight against these structures, we don't consider those people evil. That the Russian people should not be exterminated in a war because their government is no good. Now, what Kennedy, to a large extent, had a sense of this danger of annihilation. He came close to death several times in his life, including when his PT boat was rammed and he had to swim for 11 hours holding on to one of his men through a belt in his mouth. He was sick quite often. And he had a sense that he had a little bit of time of life to do something. And here's what he did. You had several crises. You had the Berlin crisis, which was a U.S.-Soviet confrontation. I'm not going to go through the details because you can look these up. The Cuba crisis, the Bay of Pigs, which was given to him by Allen Dulles, the CIA director. And they wanted Kennedy, when they knew it would fail, they wanted Kennedy to go in with the Air Force, and he said no. And he was the only person, along with his brother, who stood up to the military at that time and said, no, we're not going to war with Cuba. A year later, when we discovered there were nuclear missiles being put into Cuba, and his generals, the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said we should bomb Cuba, Kennedy said, no, we're not going to. Even the blockade that we did brought us close to war. But what was going on behind the scenes? John Kennedy was moving to end the Cold War. The Cold Warrior was prepared to end the Cold War. He was talking through back channels with Khrushchev. After 1963, the beginning of the year, he started talking to Castro through back channels. And despite the pressure from his military and all of his advisors to go into Vietnam full force, he stood alone against them and said no. He took the advice of Douglas MacArthur, who said anyone who wishes to fight a land war in Asia ought to have his head examined. And according to General Maxwell Taylor, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and who wanted to go to war, Taylor said there was only one person against the Vietnam War, and that was John Kennedy. And Kennedy stood up against these forces. He stood up against the CIA, against this military-industrial complex, knowing that they had guns aimed at his head. He made the joke to his brother Robert after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended And Robert said, well, it looks like we won. And John said, well, maybe tonight's the night we should go to Ford Theater. Remember, at the end of the Civil War, Lincoln went to Ford Theater and was killed. Kennedy had a sense that that was coming. Now, he also took on the Democratic Party with the Civil Rights Movement. The Democratic Party in the South was opposed to the Civil Rights Movement, and Kennedy fought for it. And on the steel issue, and I'll just briefly reference this, when the steel companies refused to accept the deal that was worked out, Kennedy went after them and said, what they did is not justified. And Forbes magazine, or Fortune, ran an editorial called Steel, Kennedy's Ides of April. The Ides of March, Ides of April, a threat to Kennedy. Who is he standing up against with the steel industry? Morgan, Prudential Insurance, the bankers, the cartels. But he had a sense of fighting for the nation. Now, I want to give you a personal view for you to see for yourself the qualities of this president. There are two short clips. One was a famous speech he made at American University in June of '63. And the second is a speech he gave to the UN General Assembly in September of '63. Why don't we show those two clips, and then I'll have a few concluding comments.
I have chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. To secure these ends, high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. To make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Marty, the second one? The second one is at the UN General Assembly in September 1963. Now, that speech, the the one you just heard, actually created the basis for Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, which was really Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, because LaRouche was brought in by Reagan to negotiate with the Soviets at another point where it looked like we were heading toward war in the 1980s, the early 80s. The idea of collaboration doesn't mean you give up your national sovereignty. In fact, it means the opposite. What we're doing today is giving up our national sovereignty to the cartels, to the global banks, to the global insurance companies that are looting us as they're looting the Europeans through quantitative easing and bailouts and so on, while they're throwing most of humanity onto a scrap heap. Now, I want to come back to what Kennedy said at American University. We are all mortal. How clear was that made 5 months later when he was gunned down, probably by the initiation of people in the CIA on behalf of those bankers, using Cuban networks, using a patsy who was an intelligence cutout named Lee Harvey Oswald. They killed Kennedy. Kennedy suspected that it was coming. It didn't stop him from doing what he knew was right. Unfortunately, it did stop Lyndon Johnson, who said that the rest of the time he was in office, he felt there were 3 guns pointed at his head. You didn't have to stick guns at the heads of Nixon or Carter or the Bushes or Obama, because they were loyal, obedient slaves to this global oligarchy. But we had a president, which you might call a shining moment in the latter part of the 20th century, who risked his life, who took on this establishment, as he said, not just for our children, but for the children of the world, and not just for our time, but for all time. And that's what Lyndon LaRouche described as the basis for courage. Recognizing that as mortals, we're going to die. But what will we do to leave a better world? And if you have more people with that kind of courage, I mean, think about the population today. People are even afraid to say something that's true because it might offend their neighbor. You go into the African American community, and I do this a lot. I do radio shows and meetings. And you start talking about Obama, and they quietly say, I agree, but we can't say that publicly. Why not? I mean, I'm white and I attacked Bush. What difference does it make? You're not attacking the color of the person. You're talking about the truth. And right now we face a moment of truth, where we still have in office a president who took us to the verge of nuclear war 2 months ago, who's adopting a health care policy and economic budget cuts in collaboration with ignorant Republicans that will kill people, and in fact are already killing people. And yet we also have the history and the living image of John Kennedy, of a president who didn't do that, who took the Franklin Roosevelt legacy and tried to project that into the future. So we face a dark moment today, but we have that kind of shining example in front of us. And when people say, what can an individual do? You can act like Kennedy. You're going to die someday. I'm not saying go out on the barricades and get shot. I'm saying tell the truth. Be truthful. Be loving, but be tough. And if you can do that, then you can take on the next step, which is to be creative. Thank you.